So in our last time together, we wrapped up all of this cosmic doxology happening in chapter 5 of the book of Revelation, much of which we just sang about, as we see this view of ever widening circles of additional participants who are included just in this symphony of worship. And as I said way back when we started the section of chapter 5 dealing with praise, it's the greatest it's ever been written. There's nothing ever written by human hands, not in the Psalms, not in secular or sacred music, that reads exactly like Revelation 5, unless they have copied from that, the second half of chapter 5. Once he receives the scroll and they know that this is about to happen, then everything begins to change in heaven. The 4 living creatures, the 24 elders, 100 million angels. Remember, just the ever widening circles of all of these additional participants in the doxology of heaven. They're praising Jesus that he is worthy. They're praising the Lamb because he was slain. They're praising the Lamb because the 24 elders said, we have been made a kingdom and we have been made priests. They're praising the Lamb because they have been redeemed. This is all in verse 9. But lest we forget or overlook what this praise is really and initially about, we got to watch this, because as we study Scripture, remember, we're always bending close to it so we can see what the text actually says right there in that verse or that phrase, and then we have to step back from it so we can see how everything fits together. We're always bending forward and we're always stepping back. You may have forgotten that the main point of this, why creation is so exuberant and celebratory, is why?
They found someone to open the scroll.
It's about the scroll. Now they talk about other things, like we've been redeemed, and we've been made a kingdom, and we've been made priests, and you have brought us near to God. You know, there are other topics and subjects involved, and they mention all of them, but let's not lose sight of why creation is so celebratory at this particular moment. It's because, remember, a strong angel with a strong voice way back in the early part of this chapter had a strong question saying, who is worthy? Couldn't find anyone worthy. John cries, and then an elder steps forward and said, you don't have to cry. We have found one who is worthy. And all of creation now, it started with the living creatures, that tight circle, and then it expanded. I don't know if you had a chance to read Psalm 148. I just referenced it last time because I was running out of time. But in that chapter, the creation itself is personified, where the rocks and trees and the waves and the clouds and the mountains and everything is personified, praising God. All of creation is on the edge of their seat by the time we get to the end of chapter 5. The reason being, if you'll turn over, before we turn to Revelation, if you'll turn over to another R book, to Romans chapter 8, I just want to read verses 17 through 22 of Romans chapter 8 and show you the background. This is Paul's explanation of what is happening or occurring in the end of Revelation 5. Paul to the church at Rome says in verse 17, if we're children, then we're heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ, if so be that we suffer with him, that we may be also glorified together. And that suffering with and for and on behalf of Christ is a major theme in the book of Revelation. Paul experienced it in his own life, but it is a major theme in that book. For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. And watch where he goes. Now he's going to his own sort of doxology and explaining what's going to happen, what all of creation since the fall of Adam and Eve has been eagerly anticipating. For the earnest expectation of the creature, really the Greek means not a creature, but all of creation, all the creatures in creation. The earnest expectation of the creation waiteth for the manifestation of the sons of God. For the creation was made subject to vanity, not willingly, but by reason of him who hath subjected the same in hope, because the creation itself, they realize they will be delivered from the bondage of their corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now. Now I know that kind of sounds a little far out, but it's simply describing the world that we see around us. From the life and death of the seasons, to the life and death of animals, to the life and death of humans, to the suffering, all in between birth and death. All, we're going to go back to an Edenic state, a perfect and pure state. And that's what the millennium is going to be by the time we get to the end of this book. So the reason that creation is right on the edge of its seat, remember what we read last time, because we don't have time to read it again, but everyone is ecstatic in heaven. They're exuberant. Everyone is praising. There's celebration going on everywhere. Why? Because he's worthy to break the seals and to open the book. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean? This is what Paul is saying. They knew that with the seals on the scroll being broken and the things that are going to follow, which will take us from chapter 6 through chapter 19 of Revelation, the seals, the trumpets, then the bowls, they knew that by the time we get to the end of that, and it's a short period of time, then that's what Paul is talking about. They knew that we will finally be delivered from the bondage of corruption and the bondage of this curse that we have been under ever since then. So with that in mind, let's go back now to our text, and that's Revelation chapter 6. There are 4 things in the book of Revelation that everybody in Western Christendom has heard about. There are 4 topics in the book. It doesn't matter if you write plays, write songs, write Hollywood script, if you're a politician, if you're a religious person, if you're a non-religious person, if you live in the Western Hemisphere, if you're part of Western civilization, and you don't live under a rock, there's 4 things that you have heard of. Number 1, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Number 2, the Antichrist, or the beast, which we'll see in chapter 13. Number 3, the 3 numbers, 6, 6, 6. And number 4, Armageddon. Doesn't mean they know anything about it, right? You may know nothing about it. I would say most people, their knowledge of any or all of those doesn't rise very high. But at least they know about it. I mean, Joe Blow on the street corner knows those things. He's heard those words. He knows that terminology. Even when you turn the weather on and you have in the wintertime a large snowstorm headed your way, what do the forecasters call it? Snowmageddon. Where did they get that from? They got that right out of the Christian Bible. They may be a Hindu for all I know. I have no idea where they come from. Where do they get Snowmageddon? It's a part of our culture. Doesn't mean we know anything like we should know, but at least we know the terminology. And chapter 6 introduces us to the first of those 4, and that is the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Before I go any further, let me ask all of you a question. All of you here and the people, we have a loyal following watching on YouTube. And there's not a right or wrong answer, but it's a yes or no answer. But everyone might, it's different for different people. But let me ask you this question. Before we go any further, we started way back in February, I think, we had our first meeting. We're in November. We've had 30 some odd, I don't know how many, 30 some odd, 34 tonight or something close to it. Teaching sessions together, studying Revelation. We've gone from chapter 1 through chapter 5. So my question to you would be, have you found the book of Revelation to be difficult to understand and interpret?
Thus far.
Yeah, thus far. Have you found it to be difficult, hard to understand? My guess would be, someone is saying, my guess would be, I doubt that you have. Doesn't mean that you remember everything, doesn't mean you fully understand, comprehend everything, but I'm asking, has it been difficult to interpret or to understand so far? I would say, I hope not, probably not. It really shouldn't be, and I'm going to give you 4 reasons why. And this will continue to help us as we go. It's going to help us more and more as we go along in this study. If we've got 4 things in mind, 4 basic, simple things in mind, the book of Revelation, as I argued when I started this, it's difficult for people to interpret if they don't have certain things, but it's not a hard book. The parables are hard to interpret. Where Paul is going in his legal arguments in Romans can be hard to interpret. Some of the Old Testament prophets, because they're using terminology or they're using the names of people or cities or nations that we don't know today, that we don't recognize. If they talk about certain metals or certain animals that we don't know what that meant in the Hebrew, we don't know how to get that from Hebrew to English, that might be hard. But the very name of the book of Revelation is, it's a revelation, not a not revelation. It's a revelation, it's an unveiling. It's an unveiling. 4 things that we need, 4 things to keep in mind, 4 things that we're always going to be talking about in this study. Number 1, you have to have an adequate familiarity with the Old Testament. And I would rather that word adequate go up to some higher level than just adequate, but at least a sufficient knowledge of the Old Testament. If we were to pick up our Bible and hold it together and you separate your New Testament from your Old, which I'm just going to roughly do, okay, there it is. What is that? 75%? 3/4? Someone could find out for sure. 75% of our Bible, 3/4 is the Old Testament. Here's a little quarter of it. This is a little quarter. It's just 25%, maybe even less than that. 25% makes up the New Testament. How many times have we gone to the Old Testament? We've gone in Genesis and Psalms and Ezekiel, and we've been all over the Old Testament. I would say probably by the time we're done, if we had some way to catalog all the times that we've made references to passages outside of Revelation, we'll probably go to the Old Testament 75% of the time and the New Testament 25%. It was the Bible of the early church. They knew it well. The apostles knew it well. Jesus knew it well. He quotes from it. He refers to it. He pulls stories out of it all the time. So did the apostles. And no one more than John in the book of Revelation. There's 400 verses in the book, and I've said there's at least 400 references to the Old Testament in 22 chapters, in 400 verses, give or take. 400 verses, 400 references. So if you don't know the Old Testament, you're clueless here. You're just totally clueless. And so when you follow people or you listen to someone who gives you a teaching on Revelation and they don't know, you can even ask them, do you know anything about it? They say, I've never even read the Old Testament. It will show. It will show immediately. You can tell by their interpretation. So that is just another plug for we need to read our Old Testament. Number 2, we just have to have some understanding of how apocalyptic literature works. This is not narrative like Luke writing the history of the early church in the book of Acts. It's not poetry like King Solomon writing the Song of Solomon or the Song of Songs. This is apocalyptic literature. And we have to know how it works. And we did earlier messages on this, so we're not recovering that ground, but you can always avail yourself to that if you think you're lacking in some area. It's written in a certain style. It does employ figures of speech. It does employ numbers and colors and animals and the appearance of angels. And I remember when I talked to you guys about this earlier, I said two things as far as people saying, well, why did God do it this way? Why didn't he just write it like Acts? Number one, I said, I think that when we really look at eschatological material, it's written in such a way that it's hidden from people, that you have to put your time into it. It's just not there on the surface. Where Luke just writes something about, well, Paul left this city and went to that city. You don't have to do any studying. You don't have to try to figure out, did Paul go from this city to that city? No, it just said that he did. You don't have to figure anything out. You just read it. Revelation's not like that. It takes more work. So part of the reason is it hides it from the curiosity seeker who's not serious. But secondly, and most importantly, I think it's the only way the story could be told. The events that are happening are just too fantastic. So it has to be written in this particular type of literature or genre, and that is apocalyptic. The third, key or aid or help. It does not hurt to have a handle on languages and grammar and styles of writing and figures of speech. It doesn't hurt at all. It's way easier to teach this group, most of you who are college professors or doctors yourselves, than it would be to somebody who had just graduated from the 5th grade. No put down on that at all. I'm just saying it's much easier if you have some kind of grasp on how language works, just language itself. In order to interpret something, in order to interpret a document, whether it's the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, or the Bible, we have to know how language functions. We have to know, how do we go about determining what this particular word means? We're going to look at it from an etymological point of view. This word came from another language. What did it mean in that language? Okay, so we've got that. It's here in this context, but don't we have probably most of our English words can mean multiple things. It depends on the context in which they're found. The meaning of the very word, the same exact word, pronounced the same, spelled the same, could have a different meaning if it's found in a different context. And so some people who just run to the Bible and try to understand what is this saying, if they don't have a grasp on how language works and how grammar works, they're going to be at a disadvantage. And the only way they can solve that is to do something about it. Whenever we looked at chapter 5, when I first began the early section, the first half of chapter 5, I taught it as though it were a dramatic play, because I think that's the way that it was written. When we get to chapter 7, we're going to study that as though it is an interlude in a play, because I think that's the way that it's written. So when you understand language and grammar and literary devices, you are really going to help yourself out in understanding the book. Any book, this book, any book, especially this book. And then the fourth point, let me just review these again. You've got to have familiarity with the Old Testament. You need to understand how apocalyptic literature works. And that just takes a little effort on the student's part. That's nothing that any of us were born with. And it's not a gift that you can pray, God, give me an understanding. You have to work on understanding, how do I go about reading apocalyptic literature? Get a handle on language and grammar and literary devices, of which this book is full. And then fourthly, and maybe this is as important as anything, and this is something that we can all have, and that is a healthy dose of common sense. A healthy dose of common sense. I'm going to pull up a couple of things that I just looked online the other day to see what someone was saying about something in the book of Revelation. And are you ready? And they're just wild. And there's thousands and millions of them out there. There's just no common sense. By the spring of 2027, so write it down. I mean, if you don't want to miss some prophetic event, make sure you put this on your calendar. By the spring of 2027, everyone will witness the final trumpet sound, and the Messiah is returning in September of 2030. So there, I mean, we've got it. And this happens hundreds of thousands of times every year. I don't know how many times it happens every day that someone is making statements like this. And people are following statements like that. They say, well, who would follow that? Well, they'll follow it when you can have proof for it. So let me give you another one. Here's the proof. Remember what we're talking about. We need a healthy dose of common sense. And common sense, I should call it uncommon because it's not very common anymore, but common sense is not something that we can extract from ourselves and put it under a microscope and analyze it and quantify it and identify it and label it and put it on a shelf somewhere. It's almost as though you can recognize common sense when you see it. And especially if you see it in someone else. Go, that, you got a situation, you got 5 people in the room, and everybody, 4 of them are saying blah, blah, blah. And then the 5th person says, well, you know what? Here's what I think we ought to do. And the other 4 go, that's a great idea. That's common sense. You had 4 people that didn't have a lot, or they weren't employing it at the moment, and you have 1 person that just paused for a moment. Common sense normally requires hesitation to think through the matter. That 5th person says, well, here's what I think we should do. So what was it that they had that the rest of us didn't have? They had some common sense. You can't analyze it. You can't, what does it look like? You can't draw a picture of it, but it involves some wisdom, some maturity, some hesitation. It involves humility. It involves fairness, honesty, consistency. It involves all of these things. The more of that we can have, the better Bible interpreter we're all going to be. It doesn't matter where we're looking in the Bible, but especially in the book of Revelation. The more of all of those things I just described, if we will be honest and fair and humble and open and pliable, if we have some common sense, even if we can't measure it, if we have it, it's going to help us out. So here was the other post. The 6th seal was broken on March the 24th of this year. And we hadn't even gotten to studying the chapter yet. We're really late if the 6th seal has already been broken back in March. This is someone's belief. The movie Late Night with the Devil came out that same day, and it grossed $666,666 on that day. And Revelation 6 says 6 plus 6 equals 12. Well, I'll give them that. That is accurate. 6 plus 6 does equal 12. Then verse 12 says the 6th seal is opened on the 24th day. I don't think it says that there. And then if you do 2 plus 4 equals 6 of the 24th year, then 2 plus 4 equals 6. That totals 6 sixes. And then 2 weeks after we got the Taiwan, New Jersey earthquakes and the solar eclipse, God and 2 angels came to me in the middle of the day while I was at work in the mother of all poltergeist activity. And there we go. Of course, nobody in their right mind would follow something like this because it borders on insanity. And I think that we should be way further down the road than to follow something like this. So back to my question, have you found the book difficult? It's not that difficult to interpret if we bring all 4 of these things in to our study and into the picture. And let me do one more thing, and then we are going to turn over to our chapter. I want to reach back to something I said a long time ago, get a hold of it, and pull it forward. And I'm sure you're going to remember this when I said it a long time ago. But the problem with saying things if you don't have a context or if you don't have the experience is it doesn't mean the same as pulling it now from the past to the present after all this teaching and experience we've had, where now it might make more sense to you. And that is this. There is a large number of people in America today, a large number of evangelical, conservative, charismatic, non-charismatic, and the number is growing, of people today who are, because they were so fed up with dispensational premillennialism, and that is all of this trying to identify every solar eclipse, every cloud formation, everything. They are so tired of all of that. They're so tired of all of that. They're looking for a better way to interpret end time prophecy. Let's just say it like that. And so as a result, they don't believe that the book of Revelation is teaching anything future from our point of view. They have become what we call preterists, or at least partial preterists. That anything in the New Testament, or almost anything in the New Testament that would appear to be talking about the return of Christ and the end of time, was all fulfilled with the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. And here's how their logical argument goes, and it has captured so many different people. And that is to say this: was this book not written to 7 churches in Asia Minor? It was written to 7. Do we really believe that, accept that, acknowledge that, and are okay with that? I am. They are. It was written to 7 churches in Asia Minor. Then they go one step further. Then you are saying to me that after we get through with those 7 churches in chapter 2 and 3, that the rest of the book is meaningless. To those people, that the rest of the book is meaningless to those people. 2 things to remember about that. Number 1, let's assume that we all die and none of chapter 6 through wherever happened in our lifetime. Is our study meaningless to you or to us? Not at all. It's not meaningless at all. Even if I never experienced it, do you think that is meaningless to me? Absolutely not. To study chapter 6 and 7, even if I die, and none of those things have happened, even if I die, and chapter 19, where Jesus returns, I'm having to be raised to see that happen because I'm not alive on the earth. Is the book, does it not have meaning? Is it meaningless just because I'm not alive when it's written? Of course not. Turn over, before we look at chapter 6, turn over to that little end of the Old Testament prophecy of Haggai. And let me just show you how this idea works everywhere in the Bible. Where a prophecy is given by a prophet or an apostle, John was a prophet and an apostle, to a people at that specific time, some of it had application to them as far as completely being fulfilled right then, and some of it didn't. That's nothing unusual. When people, and I'm telling you because I look at all this stuff and this is my profession, I'm just shocked at the number of people and the number of professionally trained people who are using this as an argument for saying Revelation was fulfilled in AD 70. And I know they have their verses. There'd be some of you standing here who shall not taste of death until you see the Son of Man coming in his glory. There'd be some of you, he said to the 11 standing here, who will not taste of death. So they go, well, so are we to assume that some of those apostles are still walking around if Christ hasn't returned yet? They say, no, all of that happened in AD 70. That's the only way to interpret that. No, that is not the only way to interpret that. There are other passages where Jesus said, you will not have gone over all the cities of Israel until the Son of Man be returned. They say, well, his return had to have happened in their lifetime. There are other ways to interpret that passage in that verse. But to argue that Revelation had to have been fulfilled or it would have been meaningless to the people, you'd have to say the same thing about pretty much all of your Old Testament prophets who follow that same formula of, I'm going to deliver a prophecy to these people sitting right here in front of me, and some of it's not going to happen for 3,000 years. Watch this, Haggai chapter 2 and verse 1. Now Haggai is a post-exilic prophet. In the 7th month, in the 1 and 20th day of the month, came the word of the Lord. Now, so when he says, well, I won't even digress there. Speak now to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the son of Josedek, the high priest. That was the political and the religious leader of the returning exile group. And to the residue of the people, and say, who is left among you that saw this house in her first glory? They've been in captivity for 70 years. The temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in 586 BC. And he's asking, who of you, there might have been a few, but not very many. You would have had to have been very young to have lived 70 years in Babylon. Now you've come back and you remember what the temple looked like. And there were a few, because they cried when they saw the new temple compared to the old. But he's talking about his people during his day, is he not? And how do you see it now? Is it not in your eyes in comparison of it as nothing? Yet now be strong, O Zerubbabel, saith the Lord, and be strong, Joshua, son of Josedek the high priest. Be strong, all ye people of the land, saith the Lord, and work. Continue to finish building this temple right now. He's talking to them right then. For I am with you, saith the Lord of hosts, according to the word that I covenanted with you when you came out of Egypt, so my spirit remaineth among you, fear ye not. And watch how he's just going to jump right into the future. For thus saith the Lord of hosts, yet once it is a little while, and I will shake the heavens and the earth and the sea and the dry land. And when is that going to happen? It's happening in the book of Revelation that we're going to study. That did not happen back in their day. So we could say, well, how could he even tell them? How could that even be included in the little prophet Haggai when those people didn't have any prospect of seeing that?
Well, it was. So.
Verse 7, and I will shake all nations, and the desire of all nations shall come, and I will fill this house with glory, saith the Lord of hosts. The silver is mine, the gold is mine, the glory of this latter house shall be greater than that of the former. And it actually wasn't. This was a little temple. We never saw the return of God's glory. It left the temple in Ezekiel's prophecy, and it doesn't come back until the book of Revelation. He's talking about something way in the future. And the same you can see in the last couple of verses of this book. Speak to Zerubbabel, I will shake the heavens and the earth. God hasn't done that yet. And I will overthrow the throne of kingdoms, and I will destroy the strength of the kingdoms of the heathen, and I will overthrow the chariots and those that ride in them. That's what we're going to read about in the book of Revelation. That did not happen at that time. So, my point is, when I said earlier that in this study, that this is a major trend right now, and their argument is, there's no way that this is future tense stuff because it would have been irrelevant to the seven churches. It's simply not valid. Like I say, you would have to throw most of your Old Testament prophets and most of your Old Testament prophecies out if we do that. All right, enough on that. Back to Revelation chapter 6. And I'm going to need a volunteer here in a moment, so you all can be thinking who wishes to volunteer. The information that we are about to read in this scenario is very brief, but it helps with our interpretation of the events that it is going to explain. So I'm looking at chapter 6, the first 8 verses. Who wants to volunteer to be my lector tonight, which means read? I need chapter 6, verses 1 through 8.
All right. New King James Version, all right with you?
That is fine.
Now I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures saying with a voice like thunder, "Come and see." And I looked, and behold, a white horse. He who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out, conquering and to conquer. When he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature saying, "Come and see." And another horse, fiery red, went out, and it was granted to the one who sat on it to take peace from the earth, and that people should kill one another. And there was given to him a great sword. When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come and see." So I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine." Oh, more? When he opened the fourth seal, I heard a voice of the fourth living creature saying, "Come and see." So I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and the name of him who sat on it was Death, and Hades followed with him, and power was given to them over 1/4 of the earth, to kill with the sword, with hunger, with death, and by the beasts of the earth.
Thank you. First 8 verses, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So do we have, this is rhetorical, do we have any idea what's going on here? We have 4 horses, 4 riders, 8 verses. So we have 2 verses per seal. These are the 4 seals, the first of the 7. These are the first of the seals to be broken. This is what we were looking forward to as we're studying chapter 5 and then preparing to leave chapter 5, because heaven was ecstatic and exuberant and celebratory over the fact that these seals were going to be broken. And now we have finally just read of the first 4 of the 7. Remember, it's got 7 seals on it. 7 seals, the first 4 have been broken. And it's this much material. It's this much material. It's 8 verses. It is short. It is succinct. It is brief. It is terse. So the first thing I would like to address is why. Why is it so brief and so terse? I would suspect, I can't prove this, but I would suspect that at least part of the reason, if not the main reason, for the brief style in which this section was given to us about the 4 horsemen is to overwhelm us, to catch us off guard, to overrun us, if we continue the analogy or the symbolism of the horses, just to trample us down with terror and fear. Because the longer and more explanation that is given about something, the more time we have to process it, to make adjustments in our mind or in our soul to it, to just figure out, to prepare for what may be coming next. So the first thing when I read this, I'm just telling you what I see as a Bible reader and Bible student when I read this, because the rest of me knows this covers a lot of information. Maybe if you don't know that, then it doesn't stand out so starkly to you. But the other part of my Bible mind knows this covers a lot of information. But it's given to us so rapidly and so briefly. And so I think that the reason why is it just overwhelms you. It just goes from one thing to the other to the other. You've got white and then, white and then red and then black and then this funny colored horse. And you have a bow and a sword, and you have balances, and you have hunger, and then you have death, and then you have disease, and then you have hell falling behind death. And then of all things, you have the wild beasts of the earth. If you just read that, you have to just read it through several times and make sure this is what am I feeling? What's happening to me whenever I'm reading this? It just happens, boom, boom, boom. And we just left this wonderful place called heaven, and now we're just dumped onto the earth. This is all happening on the earth. Remember, it was read in verse 4. There went out another horse that was red, and power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth. to take peace from the earth. We've been in heaven for the last 2 chapters, and it's been wonderful. And everything changes. The tone of everything changes. And we have to change with it. And we have to recognize that everything has changed. We have gone from this glorious place in heaven to being just thrown down here on earth, because we need to see what the impact is on the earth. It's fast, it's rapid, it's just one thing after the other. And I think that is meant to just overwhelm us and shock us and terrify us as we see all these things happening. Had it been spread out in a chapter or 2, it just would not have the same effect. Now, there are other portions of the Bible that talk about Matthew 16, if you will, that talk about signs. They talk about signs. Signs come and you can learn things or be given an advance notice by signs. Just look over real quickly in Matthew 16, and then we'll look at some passages in 1 and 2 Timothy. For instance, in Matthew 16, Jesus said in verse 1, "The Pharisees and the Sadducees came and tempting desired him that he would show them a sign from heaven. And he answered and said unto them, when it's evening, you say it'll be fair weather because of what the sky looks like. And the same thing with the morning. And he said, O hypocrites, you can discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times." He's talking about his first advent and who he was. He was the person of the Messiah. But what he is doing is he is definitely criticizing them. How is it you are good weather forecasters, but you can't recognize spiritual things? Verse 4, "A wicked and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign, and there will no sign be given unto it except one." And of course, he gave many more. But that is the sign of Jonah. And that's the 3 days in the earth. And if you turn over then to 1 Timothy chapter 4, look what Paul says here. He said, "The Spirit speaketh expressly that in the latter times some will depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of demons, speaking lies in hypocrisy, having their conscience seared with a hot iron, forbidding to marry, and commanding to abstain from meats, from which God hath created to be received with thanksgiving of them which believe and know the truth." My point is, in that first verse and following, Paul said, here are some signs. You want some signs of the latter times? Well, one of them is people who forbid to marry, and the other are people who command to abstain from meats. You say, well, people have always been doing that. I know. Then turn over to 2 Timothy 3. And I'm not going to read all this because I don't want to be short on time tonight. But from the same author to the same recipient, 2 Timothy 3:1, "This know also that in the last days," that's what Revelation is talking about, the last days, the end of time. "In the last days, perilous times shall come." And then he gives us this catalog from verse 2 through verse 7. And I'm not going to read all that. But you just see what's going on among mankind, the humans on the earth. But they're kind of general, aren't they? Men will be lovers of their own selves. Well, has there ever been a time when men weren't lovers of their own selves? Covetous. Has there ever been a time when people weren't covetous? Boasters, proud, and so forth. Now, yes, it could definitely be argued that there could be some kind of measurable increase in those things. And, that's neither here nor there for our study, but I would say that probably could be done and documented and demonstrated. But those are just such general signs. What we are given with the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are very, very specific. That's what makes the difference when you come to Revelation 6 versus any of these passages we just looked at and some others that we could look at but that we won't, where those talk in generalities, this talks very, very specifically. And to understand one of them is going to help us understand the other and so forth. All right. That was all basically introduction. Now let's start with chapter 6, having read this. Before I start actually trying to go through the meaning of each of these individual verses, and try to remember that for every seal there are 2 verses. So the first seal takes up, and it just happens that way, and it's good and easy organization for us in our Bible. You've got 2 verses per seal of these 4 and 8 verses overall. What I want to do is just start with some broad observations that are going to create a setting and provide us with some very thoughtful information to help us interpret. And I have a dozen or so of these. So let's go down this path. And I will give them to you in a particular order. And just see what you learn before we try to figure out what's the first horse about. Let's just try to take a step back and look at all of it together. Here are some broad observations. Number 1, we actually know, remember it's called the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse? We actually know less about the horsemen than we do about their horses and their accoutrements. That is, what they're wearing or what they're carrying. We study them under the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, so we think man 1 horseman, man 2 horseman. And I'm saying to begin with, we actually know far less about the horsemen in this passage than we do about the horses that they're on and their accoutrements. For instance, the first horse, we don't know about the rider, but the first horse is white. And we know a couple of accoutrements of the rider, a bow and a crown. We know that much. When we come to the second, we know something similar. On the second one, we know, starting in verse 3, that when he opened the second seal, that the horse, don't know much about the rider, but that the horse is red and that he has a great sword. And when we get to the third one, we don't know much about him, but we do know he's carrying something in his hand. He's carrying a pair of balances. And then we hear this mysterious voice make some kind of announcement concerning the balances that he's carrying. So the first point I would make is we know less about the horsemen in this passage than we do about their horses and what they're wearing or carrying. Number 2, keep in mind that these 4 horses and their riders are the result of the first 4 seals being broken. When the first seal is broken, the first horse and its rider comes out. And there's a 1-to-1 ratio, the second, the third, and the fourth. And Jesus is the one breaking each one of these seals. Which brings me to the third point. It is the Lamb of God that we study this glorious 4th chapter about, who personally permits them onto the world scene. Well, I can say more than permits them. I mean, he is directly involved. His breaking of the seal is causing them to come forth. It's no accident. It's no surprise. It's not against his will. It's not without his direct approval, oversight, supervision, permission. In other words, this isn't just the nations of the world reacting or doing something on their own. And many times in Scripture, if we don't have the prophet's interpretation of what's going on in the world, then it just appears like the world is working. But they're not. It happened with Israel in Israel's fall to Babylon. It looked like that Babylon had just, of its own power and accord, risen to power, overthrew Assyria, and then went and attacked Judah. But what we're told by the prophets is that was God's plan all along. He was the one directing all of it. And then it looks like that the Medes and the Persians rose after Babylon. Just looks like, and you can study. There is actual history It's all on the cuneiform text. It's there in archaeology that they just rose to power. What the prophets have said is that behind the scenes, God is the one who determined that. Because in Isaiah's book, he had actually prophesied 200 years before the birth of King Cyrus, before Babylon even was taking over Israel, and before Medo-Persia conquered Babylon and took over Israel. 200 years before the birth of Cyrus, Isaiah prophesied, Cyrus will be my servant and he will let my people go. And that's exactly what he did. So we need to keep in mind that whatever we see happening out there in the world is all under direct supervision of God. And more specifically, when these seals are broken and each event that follows, we can take comfort. There's nothing to worry about because we know that Jesus is the one breaking the seals and he is the one who is personally directing this to come about. In the fourth place, general broad observations. I don't know if you've noticed this with all of these series of judgments, with the seals, with the trumpets, with the bowls, there is always, with all of them, a 4-3 division. The first 4 are together and have to do with something, and the final 3 are together with themselves and have to do with something else. That's not artificial. No one has artificially placed this on these judgments. If you look at them carefully, you can see, yes, there definitely is a 4 and a 3 division. So that's why we only looked at the first 4 tonight. Why? Because there are only 4 horsemen. We still have 3 more seals to go. There's no horses with them. They're dealing with something different. They are dealing with something totally different than what the first 4 are. And then if you'll turn over to chapter 8, let's just jump ahead and look at the trumpets, and you will see the same thing will be true with them. In chapter 8, we're going to have the beginning of the trumpets. I'm just going to kind of highlight this. Look at verse 7, the first angel sounded. Look at verse 8, the second angel sounded. Verse 9, the third angel sounded. And then look at verse 12, and the fourth angel sounded. And then look at verse 13. See, so we have 4. I'm saying there's always a 3 and 4, a 4 and 3 division. Look at verse 13. And I beheld, and I heard an angel flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth by reason of the other voices of the trumpet of the 3 angels, which have yet to sound. He divided the first 4 from the final 3. Okay? And these final 3 trumpets, the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th, also go by another name, and they're called a woe, a W-O-E, which is a famous word brought over from the Old Testament prophets when they would say, woe unto this nation. That's not a new use by John. John is bringing that definitely from the Old Testament because of all of the prophetic woes in the Old. So then if you look in chapter 9 and verse 1, the 5th angel sounded, so that is the first woe. Then look at verse 12. 1 woe is past, and behold, there come 2 woes more hereafter. And then you see verse 13, and that the 6th angel is the second woe. And then if you go all the way over into chapter 11 and verse 14, the second woe, or the 6th trumpet, is past. Behold, the third woe cometh quickly. And sure enough, in the very next verse, we have the 7th angel sounding his trumpet. So do you see what I'm saying? There's always a 4 and a 3 division. This is just, a broad overlook of all of the seals. We want to have all of this broadness under us before we start looking at it real carefully. And I don't think I'll take the time, but if you look at the bowls, all of which are in chapter 16, you'll see that the first 4 have reference to something, and then by the time we get to the 5th, 6th, and 7th, they are a little broader in nature, and they speak to something a little different. Okay, so back to my dozen or however many points. I think I'm on number 5. Have you noticed this? Am I on number 5? Okay, have you noticed this? That there's also a one-to-one relationship between the first 4 seals and the 4 horsemen and the 4 living creatures. We have only seen them praising and worshiping in chapters 4 and 5. We've seen them with many wings, many eyes, holy, 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 to God who was, who is to come. And all of a sudden, they are brought back into the picture now with all 4 seals, all 4 horses. And I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard, as it were, the noise of thunder, one of the 4 living creatures. They are personally involved. And what did we study about them before? They are in the closest proximity to God. They are in the closest proximity. Every scripture that talks about them has them there. And here they, these mighty, mighty created beings, with a wheel within a wheel. Ezekiel 1, these mighty created beings are directly involved in the beginning of these judgments on the earth in a one-to-one relationship. I just find that very interesting. And just for future reference, they will also become involved in the next series of judgments as well. Number 6. I would say, and I've got to prove this in my teaching in the future, but I would say and argue that this is the beginning, chapter 6 and verse 1 is the beginning of God's end time judgments on the earth. It's been long awaited by heaven. It's been long prophesied in the Old Testament. When does it actually start? I believe that it starts right here. My 7th point would be similar. It just becomes more specific. That I would say this is the beginning of the period that is often referred to as the tribulation. That is a biblical word. Jesus uses it over in Matthew 24. It is a biblical word. It is a biblical concept. And I believe it refers to the last period prior to the return of Christ, where we will see God's judgments poured out on the earth. And at the beginning of that period, the very start of that period, not a day before, not a day after, the very beginning of that period of the tribulation starts here in chapter 6 in verse 1. And I would also say, still a part of this same 7th point, that based on other scriptures, you can't determine that from this, but based on other studies that we will do, this appears to be more specifically the first half of the tribulation. That the tribulation is divided in half is beyond doubt, because it's done in Daniel several times, and it's done a half a dozen times right here in the book of Revelation, where it is divided in half by different terminology, either 42 months or 1,203 score days, 1,260 days, or a time times, a time is 1, times is 2, so 1 plus 2 is 3, times and a half time, that's 3.5 years, or a time, 1, times 1 plus 2 equals 3, and the dividing of a time, which would be a half a time. I hope I'm not confusing you, but these are all the references, the terminology that the Old and the New Testament use. You have 42 months, you have 1,260 days, you have 3.5 years. And they all equal the same. Basically, if you use a 30-day calendar, they're all equaling the same period of time, which is the tribulation period, but more specifically, and I think I can easily show this, that these verses with regard to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse have to do with the first part of the tribulation, and maybe even the very early first part of the tribulation. Number 8, let me hurry along. The Holy Spirit who inspired this, and the Jewish Apostle John who wrote it, most certainly intend, as soon as we read this, for us to go, Zechariah, because that's where they're found. Immediately that should come to our mind. If it doesn't, then what does that tell us? We are deficient in our knowledge of the Old Testament. And that's okay. You've got to be deficient in any and everything before you may become proficient. Immediately, that's the first thing that comes to your mind, because there are 3 places in the Bible, 2 in Zechariah and 1 here. There are 3 places in the Bible. They're all in apocalyptic literature that deal with colored horses and their riders. Now, just because, let me just jump way ahead, and you already probably know where I'm going, because I'm trying to make sure we are all very smart people. Just because 2 passages mention the same thing doesn't mean they are the same thing. It just means it mentioned it. It could be the same thing. It could be a further development or elaboration of it. It could pull parts of that and carry it forward, or it could mean the whole thing. But we should immediately think Zechariah chapter 1, that was his first vision, and Zechariah chapter 6, which was his 8th vision. Zechariah the prophet, who was prophesying the same time as Haggai was, has a series of 8 visions that happen on one night. And the first one covers colored horses, and the 8th one in the beginning of chapter 6, or his last one, all that happened on one night covers colored horses, and so does this. So that's no accident. That is no coincidence. Why are we having horses with different colors riding out in judgment? John didn't just reach into a hat and pull something out. John is using this under the Holy Spirit's direction based on what he knows is in the Old Testament. And so, what does that tell our mind? If I'm going to totally understand this, if I'm going to have a good grasp on it, or at least a reasonable grasp, I probably need to go back to Zechariah. If you're going to read the last chapter of the book and understand it, you might want to go back and read the first chapter or a previous chapter to get your understanding. So Zechariah has 2 chapters. You don't have to do the whole chapter, just a part of chapter 1, the first part, and the first part of chapter 6. Number 9. We are first given the color of each horse before we're given any other information. That's what's provided first. If, this is just if, because if didn't happen, if that's all we had been given, we could still come up with a pretty guess at the meaning. But thankfully, that's not all we're given. The color, along with the rider, along with his accoutrements, will help solidify the meaning. But we're given that color first. Number 10. The first 3 carry an object in their hand. The 4th one doesn't. I'm trying to have you see this whole picture. It's got many moving pieces that go together. The first 3 carry an object. And we're actually told what that object is. It's going to help us identify what's going on. Remember what I said 30 minutes ago, how terse and brief and succinct this was? And we wish that it was bigger and we had more information, but it was given that way so it just overruns us like the horses galloping out of this chapter would do. But thankfully, even though it's brief, and he didn't use much space to tell us anything, he did tell us that the first 3 riders each are carrying an object, and he told us what that object was. Number 11. We know a piece of attire for the first rider. That will help us with our interpretation. Number 12. Only one horseman is given a special command. Which one was that? You see, it becomes all jumbled in your mind, but you're going to become very familiar with this by the time we're done. You're going to go, oh, I know the color, and I know what he has and what he's doing and where he's going. It's just all a bunch of pieces of a puzzle right now. Only one horseman was given a special command, and that's the 3rd one. The others aren't talked to. This one is talked to, and that command is given in the form of both a description and a prohibition. And notice where that command comes, from where it comes, from the throne of God. That's interesting. In number 13, we only know the name of one of the riders. See, we talk about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. We don't know much about them. We just know about their horses and what they're carrying and wearing. We only know the name of one rider, and that is the fourth one. Number 14, following on the heels of that, we know the name of the follower of the rider of the fourth horse. He's actually a fifth subject who does not come on a horse. I hope this isn't confusing to you. And finally, I think this is number 15 or somewhere along that line, and this is kind of trying to sum this up. I know we only have 8 verses, but I think these 8 verses, along with help from Zechariah chapters 1 and 6, along with any other commentary that we can find on this, and I think that we have an excellent one in Matthew 24 from the lips of Jesus himself, which is really interesting that he gives a commentary. It's an anterior commentary to a posterior recording. He is giving a commentary, no doubt, on something that had not even been given yet, and that is Revelation chapter 6. And you'll see more of what I mean whenever we try to put all the pieces together. So these 8 verses, this is at minimum. Zechariah, because he talks about 2 different occasions of colored horses. We want to see what can we take from Zechariah's 2 occasions of colored horses. And Jesus' own commentary, even though it was anterior to this being given, we put all this together, and I think that we will be able to determine both the purpose and the mission of the 4 horses and the 4 horsemen.
Fairest,